The natural law. We're going to be looking in this video at the idea of natural law through the work of the legal philosopher whose name has come to be most closely associated with the idea, Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas wrote the Summa Theologiae in a tightly structured way. He begins with a question, which Aquinas then breaks down into a series of sub-questions called articles. For each sub-question, Aquinas begins by giving the wrong answer. Then he may quote an authority who supports the right answer. And then he will proceed to explain what he thinks is the right answer and to deal with all the objections to his argument. Having established what is the right answer, he then moves on to the next sub-question and repeats the method. Once all the sub-questions have been answered, he then moves on to the next question. Although this method is highly logical, the answers Aquinas gives and the ways in which his answers link together are not always straightforward. Using an analogy from chess, one commentator has said about Aquinas that his ideas move more like knights than rooks and are no less difficult to corner. Although Aquinas' name has become synonymous with the idea of natural law, it is in fact only a small part of his architecture of law. Aquinas asked 25 questions about law, of which 8 deal with the old law, 9 deal with the new law, 3 deal with human law, and only 1 deals with the natural law. The question on natural law is broken down into 6 sub-questions, which we will explore in the remainder of this video. First, Aquinas asks, what is the natural law? The answer is that the natural law are those moral principles which are known to us through a properly formed conscience. The other word Aquinas uses, synderesis, may be one which is new to you. Synderesis refers to the innate ability of the human mind to know the first principles of natural law and moral reasoning. It's often described as an intuitive, instinctive knowledge of good and evil, guiding human actions towards the good. In an earlier question, number 91, Aquinas argues that human beings know the natural law in ways that are linked both to our reason and to our will. Aquinas claims that there are certain principles that are known naturally, and that those principles form the basis for right reasoning about what is good for ourselves, what is good for those we love, and what is good for society. Aquinas also claims that our appetites direct us towards things which are good. We want to eat because eating is good for the health of our bodies. We want to have sex because sexual reproduction ensures the survival of the human species, and so on. What Aquinas has in mind may become clearer as we move on to the second question he asks. What are the precepts of the natural law? If we're going to do any sort of reasoning, we have to start somewhere. For Aquinas, we have to start with first principles. Those first principles, Aquinas believes, are self-evident. By self-evident, he means that they're indemonstrable, but also that they require no demonstration. You cannot reasonably deny them. Have you ever tried to have an argument with a 3-year-old? 3-year-old children are good at asking one question again and again, and that question is, but why? When their parents are telling them to do something they do not want to do, the 3-year-old child will ask, but why? Whatever answer the parent gives to that question, the 3-year-old child's next question will be, but why? Very soon, the exasperated parent ends up saying, because I told you so. That's an indication of where you get to the bottom of reasoning. For Aquinas, self-evident principles are principles which sit at the bottom of human reasoning. The first self-evident principle Aquinas puts forward is that good is to be done and ensured, and that evil is to be avoided. Aquinas says that all other principles of the natural law are based upon this, so that whatever the practical reason naturally apprehends as a man's good or evil belongs to the precepts of natural law as something to be done if it's good or to be avoided if it's evil. Now, the statement that good is to be done and that evil is to be avoided is, like Kant's categorical imperative, a purely formal principle. What we need to know is what sorts of things are good for human beings and what sorts of things are evil. Here, Aquinas appeals to our natural inclinations. Our natural inclinations, the things we desire, are naturally apprehended by our reason as good, so that our desires and our reasons ought to align to lead us to pursue the things that are good for human beings and to avoid the things that are bad for human beings. Aquinas doesn't stop there, however. He suggests that human beings have natural inclinations at 3 different levels. Natural inclinations simply because we're alive, natural inclinations because we're animals, and natural inclinations because we have reason. The natural inclinations we have simply because we're alive include our survival instinct. Aquinas says that by reason of this inclination, whatever is a means of preserving human life and warding off its obstacles belongs to the natural law. The natural inclinations human beings share with other animals include sexual intercourse, education of offspring, and so on. The natural inclinations we have because we have reason include, according to Aquinas, a natural inclination to know the truth about God and a natural inclination to live in society. From these ideas, Aquinas derives principles such as the desire to shun ignorance and the desire to avoid offending those amongst whom one has to live, and other such things regarding these inclinations. At this point, Aquinas has set out the key elements of his argument for natural law. The natural law is the set of moral precepts which we cannot sensibly deny and which should shape our reasoning and our desires. Aquinas then turns to his third question: whether all acts of virtue are prescribed by the natural law. Now, as a Christian theologian and a monk, Aquinas' arguments about our natural desires and reason help us Aquinas then turns to his third question: whether all acts of virtue are prescribed by the natural law. As a Christian theologian and a monk, Aquinas' argument about how our natural desires and our reason help us to identify the natural law runs into an obvious objection. The objection is this: so you say that the survival instinct is part of the natural law, but what about martyrs? You say that sexual reproduction is part of the natural law, but what about Jesus, Paul, and all those Christian monks and nuns? Aquinas' answer is that not all virtuous acts are prescribed by the natural law, for many things are done virtually, but Aquinas then turns to his third question: whether all acts of virtue are prescribed by the natural law. As a Christian theologian and a monk, Aquinas' argument about how our natural desires and our reason help us to identify the natural law runs into an objection. The objection is this: you say that the survival instinct is part of the natural law, but what about martyrs? You say that sexual reproduction is part of the natural law, but what about Jesus, Paul, and all the Christian monks and nuns? Aquinas' answer is that not all virtuous acts are prescribed by the natural law. For many things are done virtuously, to which nature does not incline at first, but which through the inquiry of reason have been found by men to be conducive to well living. Aquinas could go on, but does not go on at this point to say that although the natural law identifies things which it is good to pursue in general, specific people may have individual vocations which call them to self-denial. The way Aquinas puts it instead is that according to the various conditions of human beings, certain acts are virtuous for some as being proportionate and becoming to them, whilst they are vicious for others as being out of proportion for them. Aquinas returns to his main theme with his fourth question: whether the natural law is the same in all of us. In answering this question, we have an example of Aquinas appealing to an authority in support of his answer. Isidore was a 7th century Christian scholar who wrote, "The natural law is common to all nations." What Isidore and Aquinas both hold is that there is a universal human nature, and that all human beings must acknowledge the same self-evident principles and see the reasonableness of the same desires. Aquinas distinguishes, however, between 2 levels of reasoning. One kind of reason is speculation. The other is practical reasoning. Speculative reason is busied chiefly with necessary things which cannot be otherwise than they are. Therefore, if we do our speculative reasoning correctly, we will always come to the same conclusions, because those conclusions are necessarily and universally true. In order to demonstrate the proper conclusions of speculative reason, Aquinas gives the example of a triangle. The truth is the same for all, but not equally known to all. Thus, it's true for all that the 3 angles of a triangle together equal 2 right angles, or 180 degrees. But that truth is not known to all. You have to be taught it or to work it out. Practical reason, on the other hand, is busied with contingent matters about which human actions are concerned. And consequently, although there is necessity in the general principles, the more we descend to matters of detail, the more frequently we encounter defects or differences. If we do our practical reasoning correctly, we should arrive at principles which Aquinas calls common notions. But when it comes to the application of these common notions, what Aquinas calls matters of detail, it is much harder to discern what is the right thing to do. The example Aquinas gives here is this: should goods entrusted to another be returned to their owner? His answer is, generally speaking, yes, but it may happen in a particular case that it would be injurious and therefore unreasonable to restore goods held in trust. For instance, if they're claimed for the purpose of fighting against one's country. And this principle will be found to fail the more according as we descend further into detail. So, for example, if we were to say that goods held in trust should be restored with such and such a guarantee or in such and such a way, the more we add conditions, the more there are ways in which the principle may fail, and we might need to impose or include an exception to the general rule. Aquinas' fifth question is whether the natural law is always the same everywhere or whether the natural law can change. His answer here is somewhat surprising. Although the first principles of the natural law do not change, Aquinas is prepared to accept that things may be added to the natural law if it can be demonstrated they're for the benefit of human life. Here, Aquinas' discussion is a little confused. What he's really doing is identifying that although the natural law is necessary, it is not sufficient to enable human communities to flourish. Therefore, he says, the written law is given for the correction of the natural law, either because it supplies what was wanting to the natural law, or because the natural law was perverted in the hearts of some men as to certain matters, so that they esteemed those things good which are naturally evil, and that needs correction. Aquinas' last question is whether the natural law can be abolished from the heart of human beings. Now, there's a lot at stake in this question. Aquinas recognized, as the Reformation would later insist, that we do not always reason rightly, and that our desires are not always oriented towards things which are good for us. However, Aquinas also thought that guilt depends on breaking a law which you knew or ought to have known. So Aquinas' answer to the question of whether the natural law can be forgotten by human beings is that there belong to the natural law, first, certain most general precepts that are known to all, and secondly, certain secondary and more detailed precepts, which are, as it were, conclusions following closely from the first principles. As to the general principles, the natural law cannot be blotted out from human beings' hearts. But it can be blotted out in the case of a particular action, insofar as reason is hindered from applying the general principle to a particular point of practice. So, for example, cheating on your spouse is bad. People who do cheat on their spouse usually try to rationalize their actions, even if what has actually happened is that their reason and their desire have come apart from one another. When it comes to the secondary principles of natural law, Aquinas recognizes that natural law can be blotted out from the human heart, either by evil persuasions, just as in speculative reasoning, errors occur in respect of necessary conclusions, or by vicious customs, or by corrupt habits, as in some societies, theft and even unnatural vices, as the Apostle Paul states in Romans chapter 1, were not esteemed sinful. Aquinas thinks that individuals and even whole societies can forget or mistake parts of the natural law, but he does not think that we can ever deny the natural law in its entirety.